Today, it is our great pleasure and very great opportunity to have Mr. Rick Rummler as our presenter. Rick is a leading veteran in the performance improvement profession, and I'm sure he needs very little introduction. In addition to Rick's 25 years of consulting around the globe, he is also co-author of the book White Space Revisited: Creating Value Through Process. Rick himself is going to start off by telling you a bit about what he is doing currently. So I'm going to hand the microphone right over to you now, Rick, and I want to thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you, Graley. Good day to everybody, and thank you for joining. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to speak on this topic in particular, which this is a very unique presentation, something that is near and dear to my heart and near and dear to many others who I'm associated with, and it's really kind of the culmination of a career's work for both myself and my father. And let me jump into that. So, but the topic is all about understanding value creation and its impact on performance. A little bit about my background. So I started out in the performance improvement field in the basement of Praxis Corporation. Training Materials Administration is a fancy name for stuffing binders, while Geary Rummler, my father, and Tom Gilbert were upstairs working and thinking and truly leading in the field of performance improvement. So it was just a great opportunity to begin to learn under them. And then, as you'll see, as I continued in the field, first with the Rummler Group in the 80s, which became the Rummler Brace Group, and then I went overseas and joined an affiliate for a bit of time in Hong Kong in the 1990s, and then ultimately rejoined my father and two other partners, Alan Ramus and Cherie Wilkins, at Performance Design Lab from 2001 until 2008 when my father passed away, and then we continued until 2016. At that point, I had an opportunity to work with a client who was doing something very, very, very exciting, and so I chose to jump into a real job, some would say, and joined the organization called MOVE, where I'm the Process and Performance Management Vice President. A little bit about MOVE is that we are in the business of total hip and total knee replacement. We are, though, trying to bring a truly holistic approach to delivering healthcare, focusing first on those procedures, but it really is rethinking how healthcare is delivered. If we're successful, we'll be held up as a model for what makes healthcare better, or what needs to make healthcare better inside our country, which is in great need. So that's a little bit about what I'm up to now, and happy to make some references back to the healthcare field, which is one of the most complicated industries, as I'm reminded now that I'm in the midst of it. But the topic is value creation, and I want to basically run through three topics associated with it: the significance of value creation, applicability, and then take you through some approaches and some models that we've seen to be very, very effective in being able to bring light to the topic of value creation. For me, the whole notion of value creation is so important because it really is the true north of performance. When you achieve clarity in terms of what is valuable, first to our customers in the market and then within the organization, it's amazing how everybody, irrespective of what their orientation to performance is, whether it's people, whether it's technology, whether it's organization, whether it's culture, all of us can relatively easily, without great difficulty, tie our efforts and our initiatives to the notion of value, if we understand it. And it's amazing how, once it is understood, how it can be an incredible motivator of change. Nobody wants to know that their work is not creating value. I've had the opportunity to work with cross-functional teams over the years, and it's pretty amazing sometimes when you pull together interdisciplinary and cross-functional teams, and you and you see somebody realize that the work that they've been doing, the person that they were doing it for, or the group they were doing it for, they didn't really value it, and just the look on their face of, you mean all that work and it's not having real value? And then at the same time, just the seeing those same people just pour themselves into, okay, I want to reinvent myself. I want to figure out how I can add value, because nobody wants to be caught on the negative side or the non-value add side of the equation. Same with managers, whether it be managers or leaders. Nobody wants to know that what they're leading or what they're managing is not producing value for somebody. And the clearer we can get around who that somebody is and what specifically that value is, the better. So that's been incredibly important for me. At the same time, I have also worked in organizations where the lack of clarity around what is value and what is valuable is an incredible underminer of performance, in that it's a drain on all that we try to do, because we're guessing and we're disagreeing and we don't have the ability to get to an answer. And I think that what I found is that we have the ability to bring a lot of clarity to the topic, even if clarity is lack of clarity. So, they can be as illuminating to show people where we assumed we agreed, but we don't. So more on that to come. Another big influence on our notion of value creation is the book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. And it was very interesting. He did not specifically approach it from a notion of value creation. He was all about the flattening of the world and the need to do things differently. But if you look at it through a value creation lens, he made a lot of incredibly astute observations about value creation. One is that we need to move to more of a connect and collaborate model for creating value. Of course, you can't do that if you don't understand what is the value that's being created and what is that chain of value. And then we need to be able to tailor that value. We need to be able to collaborate in creating that value. We need to be regularly review and optimize the value we're bringing. All of which suggests that we need to have a view of that value and appreciation for it. So for me, when I look at these concepts, they're applicable to every organization I've ever had a chance to work in, whether it be public or private or nonprofit, and across all industries and even all organization sizes. And even as a startup now, I would say, being a startup now, I would say that it's even more important because we don't have extra resources. We have to be laser focused on the value we're trying to bring and who we're trying to bring it to. In order to be successful, because we're running against the clock to see if we can't prove that value before we run out of money. It's also applicable to all levels of performance. So I'm going to show you a set of models and approaches, and I realize when you look at other people's models, it's kind of like looking at pictures of other people's grandchildren. They're really just not that interesting. Cute maybe, but not that interesting. So ask you to bear with me. I'll try to provide a series of examples, but just keep in mind that no matter what example I'm showing you, it is scalable. So it can be taken applied at a unit level, at a department level, at a division level, at an enterprise level, and is applicable to all aspects of performance. Now, it really starts with the notion of value. So the concept we're all familiar with is that of value chain. And so just kind of want to use that as an orienting vehicle for us. And how we create value typically works left to right in this picture. So we're taking inputs from the supplier side. We are converting them into value that then goes to a market and a set of customers, and it may well be that our customers have customers, and that's the value chain. But at the same time, how we understand value actually works the other way. It works right to left. So now occasionally we can create value and the customers don't yet know they need, but it still has to be validated by those customers. So ultimately, we're going to understand it and refine our understanding of value working right to left. So looking for the right partners, the right suppliers, the right resources to be able to give us the inputs we need to create value for our customers. So that's the big picture view. There's a box right in the middle in the business view, and although it says business, it could be any organization, and that's the management system. Now, what's key about the management system is the definer of what is the value we are going to choose to deliver to a customer or a specific segment of customer. I like the Michael Dell quote, I only want to provide as much quality as the customer is willing to pay for. So it's a balance, right, in terms of here's the value we're going to create. There's not a lot of reason to create excessive value the customers are not willing to pay for, but at the same time, we don't want to be on the other end of the scale and not be able to provide the level of value that our customers require in order to pay. So it's all about creating that balance, and that management system is the balancing mechanism within that. Now again, keep in mind this is relative and scalable. So that value creation system could be the value creation system for the training department, could be the value creation system for a whole division of an organization. The same concept applies. We have suppliers and we have customers. So some definitions to go with the last slide, so that it stands alone when you have access to the deck later. Value creation system is the part of the value chain that we control. Value chain includes the customer's customers, suppliers. Okay, and lastly, and a key is oftentimes in organizations there are multiple value creation systems. So it's important to identify how are we defining those value creation systems. Are they service lines? Are they product lines? Understanding what are those distinctions, how they relate to that market, and also essential is, and what are the expected synergies between those value creation systems? Ideally, we don't have the old school mentality of if I have multiple service lines or multiple product lines, I want them to compete for customers, because that ultimately is a challenging way for an organization to try to succeed. But it's important we understand what those synergies are and ask those questions. So I want to talk through two fundamental approaches for understanding value creation. The first one is outside in, and the second one is macro to micro. But a little bit, take a quick sidestep. I want to talk about that for both approaches, the models we're going to use are visual. And so there's lots of different ways you can model, but for us, the notion of visual modeling is critical, has been for, was raised with the idea, and I'll talk to that in a second. But the purpose is to illuminate the system of value creation and the variables so we can test and clarify. And again, sometimes clarifying is clarifying the lack of understanding, because that's telling in terms of what we're going to be working against in terms of understanding and where the opportunities are. But trying to get a clarity around all the variables is critical, because we might not be able to affect all the variables that impact performance, but we can't afford to be blindsided by those variables that are there, but we're not able to affect. So we have to be cognizant of all the variables that impact performance, and we need to make sure that our stakeholders are aware of those variables. So it's a shared understanding of variables, and our ability to affect them is so important to being able to impact value creation. Then we have the ability to create shared understanding, which is essential. And then we can actually have true stakeholders in terms of, okay, what's the reality? What's the gap we're trying to close? What are the trends associated with it? And where are we trying to get to? And so nothing does that better, from my experience, than a visual model. So my father was asked this question by ASTD. I've always appreciated both the question and the response. So he never stopped making diagrams, even if they do strike people as being complex. He just might work on doing a better job of them. But the key thing is that it allows you just to see the relationships between things. Okay, that you just can't do in a Word document. And also, what I've always found very, very powerful, it allows people to be able to draw insight without you having to tell them. So the more we can create self-discovery versus us having to tell people what our conclusions are, the much better off we are. It's a lot easier for people to sell themselves than it is for us to sell them on something we want to bring to their attention. So looking at the outside in, the model that we've found incredible value for is called the super system map. And my challenge is to not use the whole rest of the time on the super system map, because it's garnered incredible levels of insight for us throughout the years. So a super system map basically has these 5 external components. So starting with the market on the right hand side, there are competitors. Now sometimes we don't have, as internal organizations or as nonprofits, we might not see that we have competitors, but there are usually alternative service providers for the services we are offering. So there's some notion of competition for all of us. There are suppliers on the left-hand side, which also bring value that we're trying to leverage to create value for our customers. There's a business environment in which we operate, and there's multiple flavors of that. And understanding those variables can be huge, especially not right now in healthcare, trying to understand where are we going from a regulatory legal perspective is very difficult to predict. And then the financial stakeholders are a key component. And sometimes they get lumped into customers, but it's wrongly. They have a very different perspective, and whether they are the people who are holding our budgets or whether they are truly outside investors, there are people who have expectations for what we're going to produce in the way of value for our customers. And then inside our organization box are the value creation systems that we choose to operate. They don't get defined for us. We have to consciously choose what they are and define what they are. Now there's a lot of industry norms, and there's a lot of generic frameworks and documentation, but ultimately it's up to us to be able to define what our value creation system is and is not, and how it fits in this picture. So that's the notion of the super system map. So an example of that for a financial services company. So here we have the market, and you can see it starts getting complicated pretty quick, and that, well, we have plan participants, but they have sponsors, and we impact those plan participants both directly and indirectly, and we do that through channels, and we do that directly not through channels. And how we're defining channels here are internally controlled mechanisms. And then the relationships you see vary as we move down from plan participants to individual investors. And here the organization chose to repeat individual investors, and we could have come up with terminology that clarified our own individual investors versus those who are not currently associated with us. But the key is that they chose the terminology that would make the most sense to their organization. So our goal is not to make things simple. Our goal is to make things clear. So there's natural complexity in all organizations. Our goal is not to simplify and heaven forbid, not generalize, but to make the complexity understandable so we can begin to manage it, and so we can begin to understand it for the ability to impact performance associated with it. I also like this particular example because it starts bringing into play some of the realities of the markets within which we operate. So in this particular case, our competitors can also be our customers under certain circumstances. And our suppliers can also be our competitors. And that business environment is something that impacts all of us in different ways. So understanding all those variables is critical background context for us to understand what's the value we're trying to produce for who. And then where's the leverage for being able to improve that performance. Another example is using a publishing company, and I apologize, I blocked out the names to protect the innocent. But here it's interesting, and I realize it's blurry. Apologize for that. But you'll see within the market box, there's distributors, and then there's multiple channels. So there, the channels are outside of the organization. Very much how we get to those end consumers, and the resources, there's quite a bit of complexity there. There's quite a bit of segmentation on the resource side. So what I really value about this look at the super system is that it really much very much brings together the notion of we are a collaborator between our resource value and delivery of it through channels to end customers. So it really speaks to the conversion of value to customers and our place in that. And getting everybody clear, what does that mean? Because we don't control the resource side. We might be able to influence it. We don't control the market, but we may be able to influence it. And the question is, where and how best to ultimately be able to address those needs for value that are among the end customers. So a couple of examples that I always find useful. Now there's incredible stories that can be told on the backs of these diagrams, and so an option is always to annotate a supersystem map. So it doesn't have to stay purely a diagram. We can add words regarding here's what we see as trends, or do a SWOT analysis on top of it. We've seen supersystem maps used very effectively as part of strategic planning exercises. But the whole idea is to be able to understand value from an outside-in perspective. The most telling component is the market, but also the financial stakeholders are critical, because if we don't meet those needs, then we won't be successful. We have to do it using the resources that are available to us. We need to do it better than the competition, and we need to do it in light of the business environment in which we're all operating. So it's an incredibly insightful and telling way of looking at performance that we've used. And the examples that I've showed you have been focusing on whole organizations, meaning whole entities, but there's no reason why the box in the middle can't be the training department, or human resources, or marketing, or finance. So any box, so any unit of performance has customers, has financial stakeholders, has resources that it uses to create value, has alternative service providers, and has an environment in which we're operating. So just encourage you to consider this as a way of bringing value to light, both for purposes of clarifying, whether it be clarifying and testing, so we know what we're working with and we have a starting point for understanding value creation. So some places we've written about this, there's been a few, and so just laid them out here, but let me use this as an opportunity just to pause and to see if you've got any questions about supersystem maps and their potential value in understanding creation, or value creation. Yeah, interesting, the notion of what is value. So, what is value is going to be what ultimately a customer, a paying customer, is willing to pay for. And that's that notion of going back to the Michael Dell quote, I only want as much quality as the customer is willing to pay for. So, but it starts with, well, what is the customer willing to pay for? And so what is value from their perspective? Now, realizing when you start looking at channels and multiple layers of customers or partners or stakeholders, that it takes some interpretation to get there, but I just want to emphasize the incredible value of having that discussion. We tend to make assumptions around the value we're bringing and who has value for them and how much value they have, but actually taking the time to test and clarify that is incredibly important. Yeah, so the idea of doing a stakeholder analysis and being able to segment those stakeholders, and then using a diagram to be able to organize the thoughts around who those stakeholders are, because the key thing is not just having a list of stakeholders and what their needs are, how they define value, but it's also understanding what are the relationships between those stakeholders. It's so important to understanding that whole value picture. And again, it's not simple. It is going to be a complex analysis, but it's important, and ultimately it's the driver of what we're trying to do as performance improvers. So that's really what the key driver for me in choosing to be a part of Move Health is that as part of our stakeholder value model, we are identifying our stakeholders as being patients, payers, and providers, and there's a lot of segmentation within those three areas. Those three stakeholders typically and historically have a very antagonistic relationship, and as a result, most of the solutions in terms of outcomes and risk and experience tend to be very niche. So they focus on one, at most two of those stakeholders. And as a result, we have an incredibly expensive healthcare system. So that's what I really like about what I'm doing now, is that we are, everything we're doing, we're holding up against this notion of, is what we're doing positively affecting our ability to create value for all stakeholders in all three of the major categories. So it's a great example in my mind in terms of, what's the true north that we're trying to always stay focused on. I'm going to jump ahead a slide and come back. So when we were looking before at the notion of the value creation system, and we had the suppliers on the left side and the market on the right side, here we're taking the value creation system as a system of work, and we're breaking it into three pieces: product, services launched, sold, and delivered. Here again, it's important to note that the interrelationships between those three areas, they're not serial. They are actually happening in parallel, and they each interface with the customers in the market. In addition to the big three subsystems within value creation system, to the left of it are contributing processes, or sometimes we refer to them as contributing subsystems, and then there's a management system above. And so those also are critical to understanding the value we bring and who we bring it to. Is just recognizing that the work associated with managing organizations and the work associated with contributing subsystems are indirect. So that has a huge impact on how we think about performance, how we would measure their performance, and that we're not going to be able to use externally driven customer metrics or market metrics to be able to gauge success in the contributing and managing area. There we're looking at how we are doing in producing value for those who are producing value for the customer in the market. So it's a different relationship, and it's important that we keep that in mind. So then the one I jumped over, so a little more definition around those three subsystems within value creation system. So there's launched, sold, and delivered. So launched, finding and inventing the product or service, enhancing it, sunsetting it. Think of that as the product life cycle, product or service life cycle, from cradle to retirement. And then the second one is sold. So here we are creating demand for what we do. We're getting commitments for it, and we're maintaining relationships with those people who are taking our products and services. Although you may not, if you're a nonprofit or an internal organization, you may not have paying customers per se, but we found that all of these aspects are still relevant. You still have to create awareness for your product and service. You are still asking people to commit to taking their product or service, and we're still maintaining relationships with those people who are our customers or are the people we're serving. So those aspects are still relevant. And then on the delivery side, there's still something that we've committed to provide to those customers or that market. So the actual act of fulfilling that order or request, and then being able to service that request and maintain what we've sold is critical. All fall in delivered. This has been an incredibly helpful model for us when walking into organizations that we don't know a lot about, and just say, it's all new, it's really complicated, and I'm still learning the language, but I know walking in, I can take all of the efforts that they're doing to create value for customers, and I can associate it with one of these three areas: launched, sold, or delivered. And so it's been incredibly helpful for us in terms of being able to organize and also begin to look for where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses. So it tends to be that we tend to focus on those areas that we have the greatest affinity for, and so that tends to create a little bit of a bias towards one or the other. And so this notion of launched, sold, and delivered we found to be applicable whether you are a training department, whether you are a one-man band consultancy, or whether you are a division of a major organization. You have to be able to do minimally these three areas and do them well to be successful. Now, these three areas can be tailored or customized based upon how the organization wants to understand itself. So launch can be broken into early exploration versus productizing. That's perfectly fine, but it's just as a starting point for us, we expect at least these three as a way of looking at how we create value, recognizing that this doesn't speak to all the activities in the organization, but this is where we want to start, because this is where we're able to gauge the value we're creating for customers. So when I look at the models for how we work from macro to micro, the model that we use to be able to get at this is the business process framework, and macro process map, but I'll talk about the business process framework first. And this one came out really fuzzy, but that's kind of okay, because the details won't mean anything to you unless you happen to be in building engineering. But the idea is we've taken what you saw on the previous slide, and we've now arrayed this framework so that we have the swim lanes associated with that. So the top swim lane are the management processes or management subsystems. The bottom swim lane are the contributing subsystems. And then in the middle is the value creation subsystems. And you can barely make out the first one is launched, sold, and delivered. Here we show them as looking linear, but we know in reality they are all three happening in parallel. It's just that we couldn't effectively do that in a diagram, but at least it allows us to be able to see what the relationships are between those three major subsystems. So that's the idea of using a diagram to be able to bring that to light. So here's an example for an R&D organization. Here we have the three main swim lanes, and as you would expect for an R&D organization, their focus is up in launch, products and services being developed. And so here it's all about understanding the life cycle and developing. And so this is their logical focus. But what's really telling about this as an approach is that what's not so important or of lesser importance are the processes themselves, so the boxes. What's critical is understanding the value that each one of those creates. And so this is one of the things that we've done that's really has been incredibly helpful in our work and our thought thinking, is that it's not about naming processes and having boxes or post-it notes that reflect the work we do. It's really about understanding the value. And so looking at the same picture we showed before, here they said, okay, it's not about the boxes, so the processes within the organization. It's about the value we're creating. So they basically define the process by the value they're creating, and use the notion of defining the value as the test of whether that was an effective way of defining the process. So it really is, what's the value milestone, what's the value transformation first, and then what's the work required to deliver that is what then becomes the process, so the organizer for it. So it's not about defining the value of the work. It's about defining the value and then the work associated with creating that value. And that's a subtle shift, but it's been very, very important for us in our thought process. Otherwise, we tend to find that most processes in organizations are somewhat arbitrary or just based upon industry practices. There's no real objectivity to how it's defined. And so this has been an incredible change for us. It's also key to being able to measure the effectiveness of those processes. So here is the bigger picture view. And so we have the value creation system in the middle, and this is again the R&D organization. And so they actually took it upon themselves to engage their stakeholders. And so there's less detail in sold and less detail in delivered, but they recognized it was incredibly important for them to understand those at least at some level, because they have an impact on those areas, or those areas impact them. And so they also found that they had a tremendous number of contributing processes that were critical to their success, and key management processes that were critical to their success. So it really gave them an understanding of what are all the key points of value that we're trying to manage as an R&D organization, either manage or influence. So we need to understand what the value picture is in which we're participating. Another view, so this is a building products organization, and this is a truly comprehensive. They pulled in every part of the organization to participate in this, so it really was a a comprehensive understanding of what their business process framework was. And again, what was most important was not the white boxes. What's most important for the value creation system in the middle was the yellow boxes. Otherwise, we were having too many arguments about what's the right labeling, and we were missing the argument around what's the value. So this was really critical to cutting through the how we prefer to think about things versus how we need to think about things. So that's a couple examples of a business process framework and working macro. So now we're inside the organization and we're understanding what the value we're providing to the market. Now we're trying to understand within our value creation system, how do we go about making that value, launching it, selling it, and delivering it, contributing to it, and then managing it. So all part of the value equation. So more on business process frameworks. It's been a key topic in the last two books, including Rediscovering Value, which is the book we wrote specifically for a management audience. Kind of White Space Revisited and Rediscovering Value cover some of the same ground, but with a different audience in mind. Questions at all about business process frameworks? So some key definitions that I've touched on, but I just want to make sure you have it for access later. So processes, as you'll see in the last two books, we really have come to a conclusion that they're just constructs for organizing value-adding work, and ultimately they're defined by those value milestones. So and that's the key to making sure that they can be performed effectively and efficiently, managed effectively, and truly produce a competitive advantage in that market. The value milestones are really the transformations that occur in our work that should actually define our work. And then a process is complete. So we've finished one process and we're ready to start the next one. We have truly enabled the processes to follow. So it really fits with the notion of, we all know that process, and any one process is connected to every other process in some way. The critical thing is understanding what's the basis for that connection, and the answer that we're coming to more and more is its value. So this process has to create a certain amount of value for the next process to be able to be effective in creating its value. So a quick example. So here's a set of activities and the groups that do them that we would typically, if you ask them, they would say, yeah, we got a process for that. We have a process for doing customer acquisition. We have a process for doing pricing reviews. And where we're kind of coming to over and over again is that, hey, what's the value you're trying to get at with all those activities? That's the value milestone. So these aren't, in this case, we've got 7 sets of activities. Well, you could call 7 processes, but we would rather see reflected as one process that creates one unit of value, which is a contract. So a process is all the work to get to a milestone. So a macro process map is the last model that I want to share with you, and basically you're going to see is just taking the same notion we've been working with of what's the value coming from the market. How then do we choose to affect that value in terms of our value creation system? We can then take that and identify where are the value milestones throughout that the larger work system. And now we're just taking the larger work system, which is the business process framework, and breaking it down into more manageable chunks. And here again, even when we talk about processes, we can say, hey, any given process, we can break it into a number of sub-processes. And what are we going to use as our organizer for those sub-processes? It should be value milestones. Not handoff between functional areas, not key outputs because we all recognize they're very, very visible or important. It should be driven by what's the value we're creating. And that may mean that the sub-processes are very different in scope and complexity, and that's perfectly fine. It's all about focusing on that value, kind of getting back to the Thomas Friedman notion of, hey, we can only change and affect and reconsider value if we understand it. So this keeps that notion in mind. Once we understand that value, we can begin understanding, okay, what are the specific outputs, critical dimensions, and targets for those values. But this is then the template we're using to overlay any process. There's the old saying, the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of details that are important in designing processes, but value is typically not in the details. Value is very much up front. We need to understand that before we dive into the details. I've been guilty of drawing some very, very complex maps with hundreds of steps, but at the end of the day, you don't need to have that level to be able to understand what that value is. An example of that for pricing and booking process I was involved in, here instead of outputs after each one of the boxes, you're really getting at what's the value milestone. We don't have an icon for that, but that's the idea. And then we're using that then to drive what are the specific outputs, critical dimensions, and requirements. With this level of definition, we can easily tie who are all the people associated with creating that value, what's the technologies we're associated with creating that value, what are the policies and procedures, what are the values that are important. So all aspects of performance we can tie to that value, but we need to understand it and make sure we're clear on it. So another example here, the big green icons are the value we're trying to get to. Then the next level down of value are the yellow, and we're using those as the definers of the sets of work that get us there. So the macro process map is really only talked about in Whitespace Revisited, one of the most recent books that we've been involved in, and encourage you to look for it there. So let me actually before jumping to the summary slide, let me just check to see any questions on macro process maps and the value of understanding value associated with a process before diving into the details. Okay.
Rick, there was one question from Roger about accessing perhaps a stakeholder value analysis process or format that you may have. Maybe you have a suggestion in any of your references.
Yeah, that is a good question. That so often we talked about the potential to annotate the super system map earlier, and that's a great way of taking that market view. So who are the market stakeholders, or it could be financial stakeholders as well, and to provide then go deeper in terms of coming up with a structure for associated with a value creation system. What value are we creating for which parts of that market? And so there's some good table formats that we've seen and used. I don't have one handy to be able to share, but it's going to be basically a table which helps us understand what's the correlation between our value creation systems and the markets and the stakeholders in those markets, and defining value from their perspective. The key thing there is to test that, and to the extent we can test that with surveys and through other means of market testing, that's fantastic. But not having shared assumptions with it is worse. So we need to have an understanding and to have a shared understanding of what that value is we're creating for who, before we can be effective in performing and improving our performance. But there's nothing to, I've not seen a special format necessarily for how to array that, but there's a number of good standard ones out there.
One thing I was thinking about as you're going through the presentation was that I just completed the Masters of Science program in Organizational Performance at Boise. And over the 3 years in the program, I certainly observed and appreciated the anxiety a number of the grad students in the program had about stepping into a consultancy role in industry with very green feet, and just getting started and trying to develop the confidence to do an effective job. Can you speak to that in terms of the benefit and usefulness of some of these models that you've shown us?
Absolutely. The models the three specific models that we've shared here and the concepts that underlie them have really been the key to our survival as consultants, basically walking into industries and organizations we weren't previously familiar with, because we're not going to be subject matter experts in a short period of time. We are not going to be able to appreciate the culture for weeks, if not months. But what we can do is understand value, and in some ways that is such a, it brings insight quickly to ask questions about the value that's being created. It's also not a, it's a different question than most people in organizations are used to being asked and used to being able to talk about. And it gives us a common way, a common language that even if I'm not expert in your business yet, or in the nuance of what you do, we can have a discussion about the value you're creating for who. Because if you can't explain that without getting into your jargon, without getting into the specifics of what you do, then you probably don't understand your market very well. And because I become probably a pretty good test. Now, in some cases, I may have some very, very niche customers who have very specific needs, and that's a little different, but then I can appreciate that customer and their needs and why you need to be able to speak to your value in that way. So at least I can see that correlation between what you're doing and who you're doing it for. And so I've never found the questions associated with understanding value to be so deep that it takes incredible amount of research to get there. It's usually quite intuitive, and more. Well, over the years, we found the models that I've shared here to be so much based on intuition that it really is how we think when we look at it when we have a discussion about any organization and we read about a company in the paper. We're thinking super system, and what the issues they're facing, where does it show up in the super system? And then when we hear about issues to how they're creating value, we can't help but to associate which one of the subsystems within the value creation system is the problem. Is it sold? Is it launched? Is it delivered? Is it contributing? Where are they having struggles? So it just becomes a very, very useful framework for us, and has been.
Coming from the academic world for the last few years, and looking ahead, it's encouraging to see the application and expertise in applying these models in the real world situations.
It's very powerful to create these models with people and see the light bulbs go off. I mean, there's nothing more fun than seeing the process of self-discovery, and there's nothing more challenging than being asked to present a report on your findings.
Are there any other questions for Rick before we wrap up?
My pleasure. Thanks for hanging in there. I know I was flying pretty fast, and if my email address is here. If you've got any questions to follow up, I'm more than happy to follow up with you afterwards. And Grayley has said he's going to make the deck available to those who are interested, and so the email address will be in there as well. And hope this has been helpful to you.
Thank you very much, everyone.